Singularity.
My name is Nicola, aka Socrates, and you're watching Singularity One-on-One. If you guys enjoyed this show and want to help me make it better, you can spread the word for it. You can go and write a review for it on iTunes, or you can simply go and make a donation. Today, my guest on the show is Professor Chris Eliasmith. And he's the director of the Center for Theoretical Neuroscience at University of Waterloo, and also the team leader behind SPAUN, which is the brain simulation which recently made headlines around the world. And of course, the main reason why I drove all the way to Waterloo to have the pleasure of interviewing Chris. So thanks for taking time to be with us today, Chris.
My pleasure. Nice to meet you, Nicola.
Fantastic. So let's just jump right in.
Sure.
So what is SPAUN?
SPAUN is a large-scale brain model, and it has about 2.5 million cells, individual neurons that are simulated in the model. And what makes it special in the world of large-scale brain models is that it can perform a lot of different functions. So it's able to do things like memorize a list of numbers, and it can also perform what are considered cognitive tasks, which is fairly special for a spiking neural model. I think what also people find kind of interesting about the model is that the only input that it gets are images, just like you'd see coming from a camera, and its output is the control of an arm, and it basically draws its answers, draws numbers to give its responses.
So if we were to feed this interview to the simulation after we're done here, what do you think the response would be?
Probably not much. It would probably be just a bunch of noise. So one thing about SPAUN is that its world is quite limited. So it can't parse arbitrary images, it wouldn't recognize people. What it's an expert on, if you will, is numbers. So it can recognize the numbers from 0 to 9, and they can be handwritten or typed by a computer, either one is fine. And there's a few other characters that it recognizes. And it has an understanding of the concept numbers, so it knows that 2 comes after 1, and 5 is greater than 4, and so on. But really that's kind of the limit of its semantic world, so the things that it knows about. So when you're asking it a question, you essentially need to pose it in the world of a series of digits. So you have to have some structure to the digits that it can then recognize and generate a response for. And it can also write the numbers from 0 to 9.
So is that sort of a limitation as a result of your technical limitations in terms of processing and simulating the brain, or is that the goal from the outset to basically focus on recognizing of numbers and performing all those relevant functions?
No, in fact, our goal really is the grandiose one of trying to build a brain, and so we wouldn't want to stop with numbers. Indeed, the only reason we use numbers is because there are sort of nice standard databases of human handwritten digits that we can use in order to basically show questions to the model. So it's kind of a naturalistic input insofar as people actually wrote these numbers. It's not just like clean typing. But no, ultimately what we're trying to do is scale it up. And as you pointed out, I mean, the reason that we stick with such a sort of small space is because even to run the 2.5 million neurons that we're running, which is tiny, the brain has about 80 billion neurons in it. But even to run those 2.5 million neurons, it takes a couple of hours for every second of time that we simulate. And so we would be waiting years and years if we tried to simulate something on the scale of the human cortex. But I believe that the principles we're using to construct the model can go a lot farther than they have. Whether they would get everything, I don't know. I mean, that's something we have to look into.
So it seems that your simulation is a very heavily scaled down one.
Absolutely.
And would you be able to tell us the exact ratio of scaling down? Because 2.5 million out of what, 80 billion?
Yeah.
So that's like what, 4,000 times or something?
Some big ratio, yes. Much smaller. Yeah, right. I was just trying to calculate it in my head, but right. So it's 40,000 times smaller. It's way smaller.
40,000. Okay.
Right. It's tiny. But I mean, the thing that's important for us is, I mean, not necessarily how many neurons you've got, but that is ultimately relevant if you want to compute functions as complicated as what humans can do, or even simpler animals. But it's trying to capture the relevant structures, right? So do we think that we've captured enough of the structure to account for basic critical features? Can it control information flow through its own mind? Can it recognize things in the world? Can it control an arm, which is simulated like a real physical arm? And can it infer patterns that are fairly difficult to see in some of its input? Can it memorize lists of information, so basically allow information to affect its performance in the future? Can it do learning? So can it get all of these things?
Thoughts or feelings?
So I would probably be happy to say that it has thoughts. Right now, we haven't really focused on the sort of emotional responses of the model to anything. There are aspects of reinforcement learning, so it kind of gets reward and punished. But I think it's far too much of a stretch at the moment to say that it has feelings.
And if it did, how would you ever know?
You'd ask it.
You'd ask it?
Yep.
There's no other way of recognizing that? There's no specific neurological or simulation pattern?
Yes, of course. So you would ask it. So asking it can come in many different forms, and you wouldn't necessarily expect it to give you a verbal response. But you could query it, right? So you would put it in situations that you might put an animal in and see if you have neurological patterns which are similar, see if the kinds of responses of the system are similar to the kinds of responses you find in animals or humans in the same emotional circumstances, right? And then you would want to say that it's processing information in the same way when animals exhibit feelings. There are theories of emotion that actually depend on you having a body. So that might be the kind of thing that you don't do convincingly until you've embedded it into a robotic body. But there's really sort of no constraints to taking the same simulations that we're building here in virtual worlds and putting them into robots.
So if you were to query it, wouldn't that in a way be like running a Turing test of a sort if you start talking about emotions and feelings and so on, and provided that it sort of gets those answers right? Wouldn't that be in a way like running a Turing test?
Well, actually, I think you're challenging my initial reply of saying, oh, you just ask it, is exactly the right one, because you're actually going a lot beyond just asking it, right? You're looking inside to see if the structures that are responsible for the behavior are analogous to the structures you find in the human brain. And one of the large limitations of the Turing test is precisely that you're just querying behavior, right? You're only saying, does it respond sufficiently similarly that I can't tell the difference? But I don't think I think that actually it might fail if we don't get the internal structure right. And so there's lots of ways that we can measure the internal structure. We can turn to things like fMRI, right? We can do all this single cell recording. All the things that we actually use to inform the SPAUN model are other ways in which you would want your creature to sort of match in order to be convinced that it's got whatever psychological property you're interested in, whether it's pain or understanding or what have you.
Let me ask you this, though, then. Do you not ever have some kinds of concerns or others about eventually the fact that you might be creating a brain in a vat?
Not yet. So right now,
But provided you're successful in the long run, as you said, your goal is to create an exact copy of the brain, if I get it right, or a full simulation of the brain. Right? And that would, in essence, be exactly the definition of a brain in a vat.
Right. So, these are concerns that we have to keep in mind as we scale things up. And I think they become more pressing as you start to, look at areas of the brain that we think are critical for emotion or
conscience,
or self-awareness of some kind, or what have you.
Yeah.
There aren't any identified areas which are, specifically for these issues, but. Ultimately, I suspect that you're going to have a difficult time actually doing this well if you do not put it in a body. And so creating a brain in a vat really might just end in the thought experiment that it is, right? You might not have a successful, adaptive, effective brain if you don't put it in a body, right? So robotics is definitely something that is important for us in trying to make sure that these models are sufficiently robust and sort of animal-like to explain the kinds of behavior that we're interested in. So I don't know if the brain in a vat per se is a big risk. I think ultimately we might have to be careful about issues of, being ethical to the models that we construct. I think we're far enough away from that as long as we keep it in the back of our mind, it should become reasonably obvious to us when we have to start taking it more seriously.
Yeah, you can keep it in the back of your mind, when you have about 2.5 million, neurons. But what happens is that the more successful you become, and the more you're scaling up your efforts, the more to the front of your mind that
absolutely.
ethical issue and consideration has to come. And then, do you feel like you have to stop at some end, or what's your attitude towards that? Imagine you're like a few steps short of the full brain simulation.
Right.
Then what? Because let's say you have, in theory, reasonable chance of success, or what you believe is a reasonable chance of success. What happens when you turn it off in the end after the experiment is over?
There are many possible ways of understanding this. I mean, even before you worry about things like shutting it on and off, things like, what kind of relationship do we think is the right one for it to have with people, right? Should it be a slave or a servant to whatever people happen to tell it, or should it have its own goals, and should it have issues, self-preservation? Should that be part of its psychological makeup? I mean, at the moment, these questions are so distant that we just don't know whether they're the kinds of things we could ever put into a simulation of this kind, or if there's going to be some fundamental barrier that makes it sort of not worth considering the question at this point in time.
Do you program for those, or do you think of programming for those?
No, at the moment we don't. I mean, I think one of the ways that we avoid, or like one of the reasons I'm not concerned about it that much at the moment is most of our focus is really on fairly directly information processing kinds of problems. Problems that, everyone's trying to solve in robotics and vision and so on, in ways that it just doesn't seem like these things are at the point where they're making decisions which can have ethical consequences, or which can, exhibit some kind of, self-preservation, or like all the different kinds of things people often think are going to be necessary before you have anything like self-awareness to worry about. And really, our focus is going to stay there for a while. I think as we get more into self-adaptation, letting the system go into the wild and begin to come up with its own strategies and be more self-directed in its development, then these issues are going to be more central. So in a way, it just seems a little bit premature. I mean, I could say things, but I would have essentially no confidence in what I said as being either reasonable or not. Because so much depends on the details.
That's okay. I would ask you to speculate on a few points here during our interview.
You might be disappointed. I'm not a big speculator.
Oh, you're not? Well, that's okay. That's also another interesting thing, by the way.
Fair enough.
So perhaps that's a good point to sort of zoom out a little bit and look at a big picture and roll back the tape of time and ask you, how and why in the world did you ever get to be interested in creating a whole brain simulation?
That's a difficult question. There was no sort of moment of epiphany where I decided this is what I needed to dedicate my life to. Rather, I began my undergraduate career as an engineer, and I was fascinated at the time by neural networks, like lots of people were. When I looked into neural networks at the time, so this would have been in the early 90s, nothing sort of grabbed my attention. Nothing looked too exciting that was going on. And so I decided that what I was really interested in, the reason that neural networks interested me is because they were brain-like. And so I redirected my interest more to understanding what a mind is and sort of much more philosophical questions. And did a master's in philosophy, in cognitive science in particular. And went from there to a program called Philosophy, Neuroscience, and Psychology, right? So something that's combined my interests, and essentially just followed a trajectory which let me think about the underlying parts and how they'd interact to give rise to simple and complex behaviors. And when I was doing my PhD, I started work with a physicist who had been doing computational neuroscience, and he was interested in trying to figure out what the principles were that governed neural computation, and so we worked for a while on that, and that was the result of that work was my first book called Neural Engineering. And there it was really a question of just trying to figure out how could you get interesting and sophisticated dynamics out of something that was similar to the substrate that brains worked in. And then, so that was in a way sort of devoid of the question about minds or what the brain actually did. It was just if I knew what it did, how could I make a bunch of neurons do that thing? And then, so I pursued that line of work for quite a while, and ultimately turned to what my most recent project has been. So I have this book coming out called How to Build a Brain. And so there I thought, we had some good ideas about how you could take dynamics and put them in spiking neurons. But then what I wanted to ask is, well, what are the dynamics that are relevant for understanding how the brain works in mammals in particular? And so I started along the sort of course of work that has culminated in my new book and in SPAUN. So SPAUN is essentially a description of the main model that we construct in that book. And I sort of didn't start out with the purpose of building a brain, but as I made my way through my philosophy degree and my engineering degree and my previous work, it became clear that, to get what I considered a satisfactory understanding of how brains worked, you'd have to build it at a fairly detailed level and understand how those details related to, high-level philosophical questions about representation or meaning or architecture of the mind and all these kinds of things. Mm-hmm. So, it wasn't really one thing that made me decide, oh, I'm going to build a brain. It was more just a general interest that I think a lot of people share in, who are we? How do we work? Like, what is it that makes me have one thought versus another thought? And just pursuing that line of interest led to where I am at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Now, I want to ask you this because it's very interesting how you moved from engineering to philosophy and then with a little bit of psychology and all that. So I have so many questions on all of those. But I have a very good friend of mine who is an engineer. He actually does, he works for a medical company, I think it's Philips, and he does support for the fMRI machines in most hospitals here in Ontario. So half jokingly, half seriously, every time we talk with him, he says that philosophers are basically, or philosophy basically is bullshitting. And philosophers are therefore all bullshitters because, engineers create things that you can touch, see, and feel. Right. So they do, quote, real work. Whereas philosophers are all bullshitters because they just build, things in the sky that you can't ever see, feel, or touch.
Right.
So
not all philosophers.
Not all philosophers. So do you ever experience any conflict between those two parts of you and your work, or do you find them complementary, contradictory?
Right. So are all philosophers bullshitters? Whenever I hear stuff like that, I want to say, all generalizations are false. And it's as true in philosophy as anywhere else, to the extent it could possibly be true. Because, you have different kinds of philosophy, and different people take, different sort of criteria for what counts as a good answer or not a good answer. The way that I use, so I'm not schizophrenic. I don't become a philosopher and then an engineer. I really do see these things as a continuum. And in a way, this is sort of the natural state of doing exploration of our world. If you look back, historically speaking, all the great philosophers are also great scientists, great mathematicians, great engineers. So the division is really an artificial one, right? The thing that I find useful about what's typically called philosophy is that it helps frame problems. It helps direct our attention to what seem like the most salient or least salient or at least important part of what we're trying to explain. Mm-hmm. And I think that often so personally, as someone who wants detailed explanations, I think the kinds of explanations that philosophy stop at are often unsatisfactory, right? And I presume this is what your friend was referring to when he said they don't build anything. But I think that, by asking the kinds of questions philosophers do and writing in the sort of analytic way that they do, they help clarify the concepts we're employing. They help set up contrasts so you understand, when one thing is different from another or not. And that kind of thing is absolutely critical for building a system as complex as a brain, because we have to rely on those high-level concepts to give ourselves any epistemic grasp of what we're doing. We can't really understand the simulation by understanding how neuron 1 affects neuron 563,000. Mm-hmm. So, building a conceptual structure that's consistent, has an understandable relationship to other ways that people talk or think in any of the sciences, any of the behavioral sciences, about how the brain functions. Having a grasp of that, I think, is something that philosophy has been really important for me. On the engineering side, the particular kind of engineering I'm doing, the department I'm in here is called systems design engineering. And this is actually a very high-level view kind of engineering. It's sort of a way of thinking of, all systems, regardless of there being chemical systems or industrial systems or physical systems, as being lots of parts which have boundaries at different places. They have complex interactions, and we can come up with quantitative tools for describing those and use the tools of signal processing and so on to analyze them as well as synthesize them. So having that very abstract kind of engineering in mind, and then having, practical sort of joined to physical implementation a lot of the time, and then having a more theoretical kind of background, I think, helps me have a reasonably good, coherent, unified package that allows us to direct our research in a way that is fruitful and then demonstrably fruitful. Like, so, your engineering friend, he wants to see the goods. And that's like pretty much every scientist, right? Show us, right? We won't believe you unless you can do something that somebody else can't. And of course, I don't think I'd be able to do that if I didn't have my engineering background, right? So ultimately, to me, I mean, these things are just, they're enormously complementary to one another. And given the multidisciplinarity of something like brain studies, behavioral sciences, being broad is only a benefit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that philosophy is very good at helping you kind of frame the questions and the issues that you're going after. So
Right.
what is the driving question that you're working on? Is it the title of your book, How to Create a Mind?
How to build a brain?
How to build a brain, yes.
Yeah, that's Kurzweil's book, that other one. Mine's more specific. But I guess, I mean, yeah, I find it difficult to formulate it as one question, but I mean, that's a perfectly reasonable way. I think that now we're moving to more specific aspects of that question. That's obviously a very big and general question. And, when we've been building models like SPAUN, I look at the model and there's things that I don't think are as explained as well as I'd like them to be. And so, we're now moving more on to issues of adaptation and learning and self-direction and, sort of things that are, a kind of question which aren't really covered by the book, but they really are part of the same question. They're still about how to build a brain, right, ultimately.
So tell us a little more about your book then.
Sure. I mean, so this is a book with Oxford University Press. It's coming out in a couple months. I think it's on Amazon for pre-order right now. But the book starts out framing just the kind of perspectives that people have taken on understanding what brains are, or minds. I use the terms interchangeably. So, I briefly recount the history which describes connectionist approaches, symbolic approaches, sort of classic AI kinds of approaches, as well as more recent dynamic systems theory approaches, all of these ways, sort of different philosophical views really, on how to approach our understanding of the mind. And then what I try to point out is that essentially none of these have worked, and all of them have strengths, and the strengths are ultimately complementary, and there really shouldn't be in tension. And so I propose a new architecture, which I call the semantic pointer architecture, and that's where the name SPAUN comes from. So it's semantic pointer architecture, unified network. And in describing this architecture, I try to show how, if we go to the biological basis of cognition, so all these other approaches really start at a level much higher than biology, understanding how neurons work. But if we go right down to the biological level, then we can discover, using methods that we talked about in our previous book, we can discover kinds of neural representations which ultimately unify all these different ways of approaching how the mind works. So I introduce this notion of a semantic pointer, and I show how the semantic pointer is a neural representation, but it's a neural representation that can be used in some cases for things like statistical inference and modeling statistics, which is what connectionism was good at. It can be used to bind to other representations that are similar and encode sentence-like structures. So this is something that classical approaches are good at. And then it can also be used in the context of a control system, which lets you capture dynamics, it lets you capture sort of motor semantics, all these sorts of ideas that dynamical systems theorists have often worried about. And so I really tried to make the argument that, if we adopt this perspective, which really starts at the biology and then looks at how each of these different strengths can be built out of the biological underpinnings, we end up with a new architecture, which is ultimately, I argue, people might not believe me, sort of a better, more coherent way of understanding how the mind works. And I do this in a way where, at the end of every chapter, there's a tutorial, so people can go and actually build these things and understand, the engineer in me has to show up there somewhere, right? Actually build these things and understand how they work. And then in chapter 7, I take all the parts that I built up to that point and put them together, and that's the concept, that's the SPAUN model, to show that it's not just a bunch of parts, right? They really can work in concert, and when they do, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. You start seeing kinds of behavior that now begin to look much more like what you find in animals than what you do if you just look at one part of the system.
So you're laying out your whole vision of the approach that you believe would be the most fruitful towards that goal.
Right.
But what would be that proof of concept that would concur or deny the viability of your approach?
Right, so I believe that we have provided the proof of concept insofar as
the simulation,
as the SPAUN model.
Yes.
Yeah, and in response to your engineering friend, who's now haunting the conversation, if he wants to know why I think all my philosophical musings about semantic pointers and all that other stuff, why I think that really matters, I would point him towards this model, and I would say, here's the model, and we can now go compare it to behavioral data and show that it has, makes the same errors that people do in working memory tasks. We can compare it to individual spike trains coming out of rodents performing the same kind of reinforcement learning task, and we see that, a lot of this same kinds of statistical properties show up there. And we can compare it over and over and over at many levels. We can compare behavioral, we can compare, do fMRI predictions, we can do ERP, like whatever kind of data that you want to get out of a real brain, we should be able to get out of our brain and make comparisons. And to the extent those things match, should convince us that we have something like the right mechanisms inside that model.
What are the hardware requirements to run such a simulation, by the way?
So we ran this on sort of generic supercomputers, Beowulf clusters and so on. And so like it's, it can run on anything that can run software. It tends to be slow. We've been doing recent work to port it all over to GPUs, and so our software, the general environment that we have now runs on GPUs. So we haven't put SPAUN on that yet, so we don't know how much we're going to be able to speed it up, or if it will be the same as what the sort of non-specialized hardware was. But actually, I think more excitingly, really, we're working with a couple of groups that are developing chips and hardware architectures which are specifically for simulating spiking neurons and millions and billions of spiking neurons in real time. And the reason that's exciting is not only because it solves a lot of our computational problems, but because then we get to make it interactive, right? We get to make it the kind of thing that we think should be interacting in the world in the same way that an animal with a similar kind of brain should be interacting. And that will raise a host of new challenges. This is sort of coming back to the brain-in-a-vat kind of thing. I think there's lots of things we just would never think of if we kept our brain in a vat that we will, get a deeper appreciation of once we start embodying these models more. We've actually built some models that control robots and drive around and so on, but not to the extent that, they have the variety of behaviors that this SPAUN model has.
So the incoming input would not be only visual then, but it would come in other ways.
Yeah, it would be visual, and definitely it would be tracking things like motor. So you'd be tracking your motor output. You'd have some sensory information, and then, you would put in whatever you wanted to. So if you wanted sound, you could put in sound,
and just
so on.
to clarify on the hardware and the things, I remember I think Watson was running on about 2,000 cores. So do you have like similar requirements, more or less?
So we don't have really requirements. We just have patience, right? So if you give me one core, I will wait a really long time. I think that 2-hour quote comes from like an 8-core machine, or might have been slightly more than that. But it wasn't a huge machine. What was special about it was that we had a lot of memory. So we require on the order of 24 gigabytes of memory to load the model to run it. So these
That's not that much.
I was going to say these are becoming less interesting numbers as time goes on, as computational numbers.
On my desktop at home, for example.
Right. So you could probably run SPAUN on your machine, and it would take a long time, though. So the processors were very fast processors, too.
So tell us again the ratio between the simulation and then the conversion into actual real brain time.
2 hours to simulate 1 second of real brain time.
Oh, wow. That's okay. That's where the difference of processing power counts, because Watson
Right.
was splitting things in real time, actually,
Right.
under time pressure constraints.
Yes.
So, okay,
Yeah.
I understand now. Okay, so since now we've mentioned the machine several times, let me ask you this. What do you think of machines like Deep Blue that, famously defeated Garry Kasparov, and now Watson, who, or which, I don't know how to call him or it, or annihilated basically his human opponents in Jeopardy?
They're impressive. I mean, there's no doubt about it, right? That the behaviors that they exhibit in their specific domains are very amazing. And they're clearly artificially intelligent. I don't think, you basically have to change the definition of artificial intelligence if you don't think they count. I also don't think they're brain-like. I think most everyone would agree with that when Deep Blue is solving a problem, it's searching 200 million possible board moves in serial. But humans just don't work that way, right? There's other kinds of much more parallel processing that's going on that might be doing something sufficiently equivalent to let humans solve a similar problem. But it's just not working on the same basic principles. And the same goes for Watson. And I think that even though our model is much simpler insofar as any of the functions it does are nowhere near as impressive as winning chess or answering arbitrary questions, I think that one thing that our model does do that those machines don't is exhibit a variety of behaviors. And so, Watson is great at answering trivia questions, but it can't recognize an arbitrary digit drawn on a board, right? And more importantly, it can't switch between those things. So something that people do effortlessly is, read a book and then go play a video game and then admire some art and then carry on a conversation. Mm-hmm. And, they're doing a lot of different things with the same brain. They're sort of, instantaneously rewiring themselves or controlling the flow of information through themselves in such a way that they can do different tasks. And that's a problem that things like Deep Blue and Watson have completely sidestepped, right? So they're specialized, right? And one of the exciting things or, unique things about people and other animals is how unspecialized they are, how they can do all these different sorts of things with exactly the same hardware. Mm-hmm. And I think we are starting to get at that issue a little bit with the SPAUN model here, and one which is maybe a little bit underappreciated in AI in general.
Well, one of the reasons why we're here today is to bring more light to your project so that more people can appreciate the importance of it and hopefully support it in all kinds of ways.
Yeah, very kind.
Now, we also mentioned the difference between the title of your book and Ray Kurzweil's book.
Yep.
So he also has his own theory of mind and his own proposed way to create one. Recently, he made headlines by being hired by Google,
right,
precisely for that purpose. What do you think of Ray Kurzweil's book on the same topic? Have you read it? And
I have read large chunks of it. There's a lot in there that I sort of didn't feel the need to read because it's about biological detail of the brain. But I sort of read the chapters which seem most descriptive of the theory. Mm-hmm. I think that, like past descriptions that have called themselves theories of how the brain works, they are identifying particular classes of pattern recognizers which are impressive and which have been exploited in the past to great fanfare and success. I think that avoids a lot of the most difficult problems that are being solved by biological systems. I think your engineering friend would be very disappointed because there are no models of how the brain works in that book. So I think it's much more it stops a lot earlier than what our work does, right? So I provide a lot of theoretical background and descriptions, but then we build SPAUN, right? So we actually show that these principles can work, and this is the kind of behavior that is going to come out of those. Whereas in sort of theories that say, I've discovered a kind of pattern recognizer, which I think is an especially important one, and the brain is just going to be that a lot of times over, are missing a lot of the hard problems of how do you make a pattern recognizer become a pattern producer that's controlling a nonlinear dynamical arm? How do you make that pattern recognizer switch between completely different kinds of information processing depending on what the input happens to be? How do you make that pattern recognizer be context sensitive in some circumstances and not in others? right? How do you sometimes learn and not learn other times? You don't always want to be constantly changing your pattern recognizer, right? Or it would become useless in situations that you would want to use it for tomorrow. So all these sorts of very difficult control questions, how do you basically coordinate your 30,000 pattern recognizers in order to do the variety of tasks in the right kinds of time frames and so on? Those are questions that I think are enormously unanswered. And not to get down on Google, but they have taken sort of a large data approach to the problems of building machine intelligence. And we've learned a lot from that. And I think that big portions of what the brain does can be captured by its ability to process enormous amounts of data and extract patterns from it. But there are a lot more not more interesting, but other interesting questions, which are avoided if you just sort of throw lots of data at an algorithm. And typically it comes down to all these sort of control questions, right? Coordination of lots of different recognizers, context-sensitive selection of which sets of patterns you're going to be looking for, control of bodies, determining what your next pattern that you're going to get is. So one thing about having a body is you can, explore your environment and be looking for particular information. So those kinds of features, which I think minimally show up in a simple model like SPAUN, are largely absent from that kind of class of approaches to AI.
Mm-hmm. Two other projects that come to my mind, by the way, are the Henry Markram Blue Brain project, and I think IBM's SyNAPSE project, which is led by Dhemetra Motra.
Right.
Would you mind to say a few words about those projects and perhaps how they're similar or different from what you're doing?
Yeah, so essentially you've identified the major approaches to doing brain-like or brain-related simulations, right? So there's the large data approach, which is kind of focused on function. They want to find patterns which they can then use in the future to do something interesting, like classify a new pattern. And then there are other approaches which focus on the building blocks, right? So the people worried about function, they don't care if their system works like the brain or not. They just want to win chess. On the other side, you have people who really care, right? So Markram's a biologist, really cares about the biological details of the simulation. And so his very impressive simulation has about 1 million neurons in it. And the neurons are highly detailed. They've got tens of equations or more per cell to simulate the activity of those cells. And the parameters are taken from lots of biological experiments and so on. And then they're composed in a column where the statistics of connectivity mirror the statistics of connectivity you find in the real brain and so on. And so you can simulate these, and you get patterns of activity that you might want to believe are like the patterns of activity in a real brain. But in a way you don't know, because you don't know what the input to that system should be, and so you don't know how to evaluate its output. They haven't performed any functions that look like biological functions, or they haven't stored a memory or controlled an arm or what have you. They've done some sort of very simple kinds of control where you have like a ball on a plate and you try to keep the ball in the middle or whatever. But of course, that doesn't look like a biological behavior of any kind. So they're at the very, very beginnings, despite like an enormous amount of computational resources expended on their 1 million neurons, they're at the very beginning of trying to get any function out of that. On the Dharmendra Modi's project, they've now simulated 500 billion cells, so like 5 times more than what you find in the brain. But again, it doesn't do anything. It has a couple learning rules thrown in and some statistics that govern the connectivity, but you show it an image and nothing happens. So the approaches which have taken the biology really seriously, or more seriously, don't solve functional problems. And the people who have taken the function the most seriously haven't told you how a brain could possibly do those kinds of things. And I think there's also big parts of function that they're missing, which I talked about earlier. And the way, basically, I think the reason that we got into science, the reason that we published this paper is because we can say, look, we've got biology that looks a lot like what you find in a biological system. It's basically the same kind of neuron model that Moda's group is using. And we've got functions, right? That is, we can do things like recognize letters, we can control an arm, we can make the arm draw something that looks like the letter it sees, we can do reinforcement learning, we can extract syntactic patterns, we can do all these things, and we can compare them right to the behavioral data of people performing those same functions. And so we've really brought together for the first time sophisticated function and fairly detailed biological constraint. And So, I don't want to downplay the work that's been done in the past, but, I don't think it's unfair to say that the biological simulations have been big and used lots of computational resources, but essentially done nothing, as functionally speaking. And on the computational side, lots of resources also, very interesting functions, but highly specialized.
Well, let me see if I can bring in a third point of view and another criticism, actually.
Sure.
Recently, I had a guest on my show. His name is Gary Marcus, and he's a professor of psychology at NYU. Recently wrote a well-known article in the New Yorker.
Yeah, I read his blog.
Yeah, talking about Ray Kurzweil's dubious theories of mind. And so Gary's criticism is that most of those approaches that we discussed up until now, they take the sort of a neuroscience approach. And he believes that the most productive way is to, of course, use neuroscience, but also use psychology. Because he believes that we have to bridge the mind with the brain, and therefore the most fruitful approach would be at the intersection of those two sciences. And psychology is almost entirely absent of Ray's book, and that's why Gary was so disappointed, for example.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, when I think trying to solve this problem or address this problem is the intersection of far more than two sciences. Psychology and neuroscience is a good start, but you also want computer science, and you want engineering, signal processing. You want a lot of things, chemistry. I mean, there's all kinds of things that you really want to take into account. But I absolutely agree. And in fact, Chomsky made a similar kind of argument in an interview that he made just before, I think, Marcus's article came out, in which he says things like, if you don't have any top-down constraints, then you don't really know what the goal is, or how close you are, or why you're going there, how to get there. And I think, so he didn't mean it in the way that I would mean it, which is that means that we need to take our neural models and make sure that when we're building functions into them, they're ones that are psychologically plausible, and that we can understand at some level of description that same simulation as having psychological states, having representations, having those representations go into a memory, right? All these kinds of words into a working memory. All those sorts of words are really ones that have been drawn from psychology. And so I really agree with Marcus that to build an interesting simulation of a brain, it's one that should be simulating a mind. And to really come up with an interesting theory of how the brain works, it's going to be a theory of how minds work. These things are not different, right? You can't sort of answer one question without worrying at all about the other question. And ultimately, I think this is another way of saying what I was trying to express earlier when I was talking about bringing function and biological detail together, right? If you want, you can call function psychology and biological detail neuroscience, and that makes me happy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So let me ask you, what do you think of the concept of the technological singularity?
Right, so my understanding of the concept, because it is used in different ways by different people,
Absolutely.
is that if we start designing systems, agents, to the point where they get sufficiently sophisticated that they can start designing themselves, then there will be an explosive increase in the complexity such that it will sort of outstrip our understanding, and we'll be confronted with a bunch of agents which are much more intelligent than we are. What do I think of that? I find no obvious reason that it couldn't possibly happen. It might not be very satisfactory.
Do you think that if you are successful and scaled up to the full brain simulation level, in a way that would be the beginning of a technological singularity?
So,
a singularity in a way?
Right. It's like in a way, if you take my goal to be to reproduce a human brain, which actually I'm not sure it is, but if we take that to be the goal, if I succeeded, or somebody else succeeds, then all you have is something as intelligent as us. And it's not going to be designing things which are more sophisticated than us, presumably. However, once we've designed, like even in a circuit like this that we've designed that's fairly simple, we could take parts of it out and replace it with something that was sort of more computationally powerful. We could eliminate errors where we see errors show up in human behavior. Now, what the consequences of doing that are, we don't exactly know, right? We don't know if it would make it a better designer of a more complex brain, or if it would just make it start to fail in weird ways and be very, foreign and maybe non-functional. So, there's a lot of things that have to happen in order for the singularity to occur. I don't know, it's not obvious to me, put on my philosopher hat, there's no in-principle reason that I see that it couldn't happen. But I can imagine lots of ways that it couldn't happen. But I just have no reasons to think any of those are necessarily going to come about. So, maybe if we make things not function like humans, i.e. we think they're more intelligent than humans, then you pay other costs which will eliminate the ability to design something more sophisticated. Exactly how that would happen, I have no idea. Maybe that won't happen, and something like the singularity would be likely, but I have no idea, ultimately.
Chris, we're getting towards the end of my interview,
Okay.
So I have a traditional 2 questions that I always ask all the guests on my show. So the first one is, where can people find more about your work and what you do, and sort of keep up to date with the progress of your SPAUN model?
Sure. I actually think the best place to do that is probably going to the Nengo website. So SPAUN is built in a software package called Nengo that we've also written. So that's nengo.ca for anyone who would like to go there. And although that website's really dedicated to the software, when we have exciting news to report, it'll show up on that Nengo website. And that site is linked to our actual research page. So if you really want to know more about the details of the research, then the research page is the place to go. But for this SPAUN model, we've got a whole slew of videos that we've put up on there. And I'm also using the Nengo website as support for my book, so there's information about the book and so on. So I think that's probably the best place to go.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And of course, I'll link to it.
Great.
But the last question, and perhaps one of the most important ones, is, do you have a single message? If people were to take one thing from this interview with you today, what would you like that to be?
That's an excellent question. It depends what the audience is. Who am I talking to? Who do I want to give that message to? So maybe I will give a message to people somewhat in the field. So this would be, something of interest, hopefully, for people interested in artificial intelligence. And the message is that we have not yet learned what the brain has to teach us. So I find that often artificial intelligence researchers define a problem, and they take whatever our best methods are right now, and they apply it to that problem until the problem is solved. That choice of methods, I think, is often made in a way which does not in any way draw on our best example solution to most of these problems, which is the brain. And I think a lot of progress could be made in more flexible and in a lot of ways more efficient and better solutions to some of the problems that people are interested in AI if they looked at what parts of the brain seem to be involved in solving that problem, how the brain seems to be solving that problem, what kinds of problems the brain is really good at solving. And if you understand those, then you'll know, when you should or shouldn't go and look at that. But I find that often understanding things like the architecture of the brain and the kinds of computations and so on is far too rapidly dismissed by people who are sort of interested in solving problems of function in artificial intelligence.
Dr. Eliasmith, thank you very much for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.